Ever think about how even a really small group can have a surprising amount of influence, especially when it comes to politics?
Yeah, definitely.
We're going deep today on a story that's a wild mix of history and politics.
And maybe even a bit of linguistics thrown in there.
Exactly. It all starts with a community that many people probably haven't heard of, the Assyrians.
And what makes them even more interesting is that they're concentrated in some pretty important swing states like Michigan and Arizona.
Right. Not huge in numbers overall, but
In those specific states, their votes could be a real game changer in a tight election, you know?
it's wild how it all kind of blew up after a Trump rally back in 2024. Picture it. Arizona, packed arena, Trump's firing up the crowd,
Yeah.
and he decides to acknowledge the Asur-Asians.
Asur-Asians.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? But that little slip up, as funny as it sounds,
Mm.
it actually ended up shining a light on this whole community that most people probably never even thought about.
And to really understand why this is such a big deal, we have to go back, way back. We're talking ancient Mesopotamia, like think Iran, Syria, that whole region.
Wow, okay, so we're talking seriously old history here.
Seriously old. We're talking about the descendants of a once mighty empire, a Christian minority whose language is actually a form of Aramaic.
Aramaic, like the language of Jesus.
The very same. So you can see we're talking about a group with incredibly deep roots.
It's amazing to think about that kind of cultural heritage being carried through so many generations.
It really is something.
But I can't imagine it's been easy.
It definitely hasn't. Their story is sadly one marked by centuries of persecution, forcing many to flee their homes just in search of safety, and sadly that hasn't really changed even in recent times.
Yeah, the atrocities committed by ISIS against the Assyrians have just been horrifying. It breaks your heart to see a community that has endured so much throughout history facing that kind of brutality again.
It's unfathomable, and that's just a small glimpse into their story. We'll dive deeper after the break.
We'll be right back.
It really makes you think about what it means to be Assyrian in America today, you
Right.
know?
Absolutely, and especially with this whole Asur-Asian thing at the Trump rally, it wasn't just some funny mispronunciation.
Right.
It really brings to light this community that has been through so much.
A community that is still fighting for recognition and a place in the world.
And I think what's so interesting, too, is where they ended up putting down roots here in the U.S.
Yeah, it's not necessarily where you'd expect.
Right, like seeing those Assyrians for Trump signs at the rally.
Exactly.
It really makes you realize there's this whole other layer to the story, right?
There really is. And it gets even more interesting when you look at where they settled. Like, you might be surprised to hear that Michigan actually has the largest concentration of Assyrians in the entire U.S.
Wow, I had no idea.
And of course, we know Michigan, huge swing state.
Huge. So even though they're not a massive group nationally, in a place like Michigan, their vote could be really powerful.
Especially in a close election. And that's why you're seeing both parties, the Democrats and Republicans, really trying to win over Assyrian voters.
It's like this whole microcosm of the election is playing out within this one community.
Absolutely.
It's like they have this unexpected amount of influence now.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how it all plays out because, you know, we can't just lump all Assyrians together.
Right, of course.
Like,
Right.
they're not this one monolithic group. They've got diverse opinions, priorities, different ways of looking at these political issues.
Totally. So while some Assyrians might have been thrilled to be acknowledged by Trump, even with the mispronunciation, others might not be so happy with his policies.
Exactly. And it's important to remember we're talking about a community largely built by refugees,
That's right.
people fleeing difficult situations.
Looking for a better life.
And some of those same situations, well, current policies could make them even worse.
It's easy to forget that sometimes when you're just talking about politics in the abstract, you know.
You really do.
There are real people and real lives being affected.
Absolutely. And just to really drive that point home, think about the story of Jimmy Aldaud.
It's a name I've seen in the news, but I have to admit I'm not completely familiar with this story.
So Jimmy Aldaud, he was a Chaldean man living here in the U.S., and I should probably clarify that Chaldean often refers to a specific cultural and linguistic group within the broader Assyrian community. They often identify very closely with their Iraqi heritage.
Okay, so when we talk about the Assyrian community in the U.S., it often includes people who identify as Chaldean as well.
You got it. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one when we're talking about the diversity within this diaspora. So tragically, Jimmy was deported under the Trump administration's policies.
After living here in the U.S. since he was a kid, right?
Yeah, since childhood.
Yeah.
And he ended up passing away in Baghdad. It's a story that I think really underscores the very real human cost of these political decisions.
It's heartbreaking.
Yes.
And it really brings it all back to that Asur-Asian moment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It makes you think, right?
It really does. It wasn't just a funny slip-up. It was this glimpse into a whole community that's grappling with their identity, with their place in American politics. It's about representation
Total.
and the very real impact of these policies being made in Washington.
And I think it forces us to ask who gets recognized in this country, whose stories get told, you know?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, especially with another election coming up. I have to say, learning about the Assyrians has really opened my eyes to the unexpected ways that even a small community can have influence,
Yeah.
and the importance of understanding their stories. Even if that story starts with, well, a mispronounced name at a rally, makes you wonder what other groups are out there, right?
Oh, I'm sure there are plenty.
Shaping our political future in ways we haven't even begun to imagine.
Hmm.
That's something to think about.